Speaking of being heard and and equity, I suppose, Priscilla Oren, she is who we're going to hear from in the latest in our SHEmophilia series, which is made possible by the Comprehensive Healthcare Education Services, better known to many of us in the bleeding disorders community as CHESS, a longtime educator and partner in this community, and they're dedicated to the education and nurturing of individuals with bleeding disorders, as well as their families and medical professionals. In this clip, Priscilla describes just a little of her experience being a woman with hemophilia. Amy and I are going to listen to it, and then you bet we got stuff to talk about. We'll be back in just over a minute.
They also would come in and stuff my nose with gauze. And as soon as they removed that gauze, it would gush. And I can remember them telling me I wasn't allowed to cry, because if I cried, it would remove the clots. And so I can remember the little me standing at the window at the hospital looking out as my mother was leaving and trying very hard not to cry. Eventually, what stopped that bleeding was a woman intern who took a long object with silver nitrate and cauterized the area that was bleeding. But in the meantime, being malnutrited and very sick, all of my pictures as a child, I looked like a waif with round shoulders and very pale because I was anemic. They didn't know what was wrong with me. Years later, I got my medical reports from that hospital experience. And in the report, they said there is hemophilia in this family. However, this cannot be because she is a woman. Therefore, it must be a vitamin K deficiency, which of course it was not.
Thank you, Priscilla, for sharing that. And thanks again to Chess for being a partner with us on this segment. Amy, what are your initial reactions to hearing that minute and 15-second share from Priscilla?
Well, I think the thing that is most concerning is that by the time, Priscilla was going through some of these symptoms, hemophilia was a very known entity. It was diagnosed. It was quote unquote treatable. It might not be, adequately treatable, but there was something to treat. And because she was a woman, because there was such a very clear delineation between having hemophilia and being a carrier of hemophilia, she was written off as these bleeding symptoms that were very clear. I mean, they were very, it wasn't even an internal bleed, what she was speaking of in this particular clip. She was written off as, being something else. And I think it just perpetuates the conversation that women continually have been fighting for their own health care and, talked down to almost in a way in terms of their symptoms. Like, it's not that bad. This is how it's always been. 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 And so I think Priscilla's story would resonate with many women who have experienced that as young women growing up with mild hemophilia.
You made a key point in there too, in my opinion, which is that hemophilia is a known thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many clotting factor protein deficiencies and deficiencies of the coagulation cascade that are not as well known and studied and understood in the medical community as hemophilia. So this is someone struggling to get a proper diagnosis of something that we know to diagnose.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many other bleeding disorders we don't even know to diagnose. So how much more often are women hearing, this is just normal, oh, you must just be deficient in this, we just bleed this way, when in fact they have factor 10 deficiency or factor 5 deficiency, and how much longer it must take. So to your point, Amy, it is part of this theme of women not being believed or dismissed or listened to with enough nuance to appreciate. In this instance, for example, where there's even a family history of hemophilia and a relatively simple blood test could confirm factor levels, rather than take that step, there's just a reactionary impulse to just say, but she's a woman. It can't be that.
Right.
Did you test her?
Right.
How about we test her? Oh, and then we'll find out. And again, what about in the areas where we don't have diagnostic tests and we don't have treatment and it's not as well studied? So it's terrible. If you're a woman with hemophilia, you have to fight for equity for your hemophilia care. That's a real and ongoing problem. But I think, Amy, you raised a larger point, which I feel in this moment a little just not deflated by, but it's just, I don't know. And I'm not a woman, but it's like I've it's the same story over and over again. And we've said exactly these words before here. And my hope is that with organizations like Chess and individual advocates like Priscilla continuing to add to the volume of people who have stepped forward to say, actually, I've had an experience that you need to hear about. My medical experience hasn't been normal. I have had some unfortunate. The more we hear those stories, aggregate those stories, share them with policymakers, share them with school administrators, get women in clinical trials, and for things that traditionally have not. For most hemophilia trials, I think all but one or two have never included women. We're taking steps towards changing a paradigm shift. So thank you to Chess and advocates like Priscilla for contributing their stories to help make that paradigm shift a full reality.
So listeners, if you want to take action, you can do 3 practical things to help further the campaign for better treatment for women with bleeding disorders. And that first one is to sign the petition at change.org. Demand equity in healthcare for women. 2, you could head over to chess.education/hemophilia/feedback. Don't worry, we're going to put it in the program notes, but you can head to that little bitty website to submit your recommendations for good doctors and hospitals. I love that one. And 3, sign the MASAC document 264, those recommendations at hemophilia.org. All 3 of those links are going to be in the program notes. Phenomenal practical things that you can do to further the campaign for better treatment for women with bleeding disorders.
Amen to that. Love those action items. And thank you, Chess, for providing those. They're in the program notes, as Amy has said. Priscilla Oren, Janet Brewer, Eric Lowe, and everybody over at Chess, thank you for everything that you're doing in the partnership on the SHEmophilia segment. Another great episode in the books, Amy Board. We have our next coming up on August the 11th. What can listeners expect on August 11th out of us?
It's going to be awesome. It's going to be the episode right before BDC, so it's going to be jam-packed with that stuff. We're going to talk about the science fair, which is one of my favorite things of all time.
I'm sure you are brimming and ready to talk about everything happening in the world of the science fair, which is a big, big, big world.
Holla!
So that'll be next time, August 11th. Subscribe if you haven't. Tell others to do so. Share the episode, all the things. Mailbag at bloodstreammedia.com to give us suggestions or inquire about casting and storytelling opportunities. And with that, that is all for this episode. A reminder, listeners, that this episode would not be possible without our presenting sponsor, Takeda.
Takeda.
Thanks, Takeda. And remember to visit bleedingdisorders.com.